Media Convergence. So, Jenkins describes media convergence as the process where old and new media collide and consequently affect how information is internalized and externalized by the user. It is interesting to note that Jenkins describes this as a verb, so it's an ongoing process of change as opposed to a static end result. So, technology use, and convergence is dependent on the needs, problems, and innovations of that specific context. So, this creates this design cycle where previously independent technologies now need to find ways and new ways of sharing tasks and resources. This implies that new and current technologies will continue to evolve and change how users input and output information. This is a dynamic process and certainly not a static end result. Users may even need to change their understanding of a certain technology and be flexible with the associated uses and experiences they've already had, and be open to new forms and ways of using the technology. As an educator, it's also important to consider how this will affect the learning process and how students show their learning. Jenkins breaks down media convergence into five main categories: organic convergence, cultural convergence, technological convergence, global convergence, as well as economic convergence. For this presentation, I'm just going to use examples that are relevant to my life because they may seem obvious, but when I really reflected on them, it became apparent of how media convergence has become a normal, unnoticed activity in my life. So, in my own understanding, Jenkins describes organic convergence as naturally using technology to multitask. Obvious examples include watching a Netflix show while casually scrolling on Instagram and liking images and interacting with trending posts. It can also include more practical uses such as using your phone or YouTube to set a timer or background noise while you use your laptop to study, typically across multiple different platforms and apps. And in a more contradictory fashion and one level up, you can even see organic convergence of technology when we use tech not to use tech. This includes notification blockers and apps to help us focus during studying, driving, sleeping, and other intentional non-tech times. So there are obvious considerations of multitasking, attention, and being present in a meaningful way, especially when sometimes you don't even notice you start scrolling. My understanding of economic convergence, that Jenkins essentially describes it as an oligarchy of control over several products or services within the same industry. I think of Google right away. It has search engines, software, word processors, news outlets, navigation systems, YouTube. Another example is Facebook. It's dominating social media as well as Instagram, WhatsApp, and even virtual reality programs like Oculus. With these massive companies, there are obviously huge considerations of power, bias, and access to information. And this is where I noticed that this definitely had to do with this, and everything got a little bit more complicated here. So, what you are passively absorbing when scrolling through the media is shaped by the intentions of the controlling powers, which are often huge capitalist companies that dominate their industry with their own intentions and interests. So, Jenkins describes global convergence as geographically distant cultures influencing one another. I immediately thought about trends to do with sustainability, and I'm thinking specifically of that straw and save the turtle trend. I know that's not necessarily a cultural trait, but it did become a cultural international trend. And of course, the more classic cultural trends of fashion, food, language, and things like that. So I was also really intrigued by the conversation of the threat of imperialism and considerations of cultural appropriation. This really got my gears going with connections to power and control and considering who is benefiting from certain trends and the spread of culture. Once again, it's deeply connected to organic convergence and how multimedia culture slaps us in the face at all times in the day from multiple devices and outlets. Technological convergence is described as merging of different technologies. I like to think of this as creating a Swiss Army knife out of one technological tool. For example, iPads and iPhones, which are phones, messaging systems, email, internet, camera, games, calculator, measuring tools, and a million other functions as well. On an iPad, it gets even more intense as it easily allows users to watch Netflix and other streaming apps while working on other apps as well. There are other tech tools that have influenced culture, including in the fine arts. I thought about how an electric piano can not only play and record piano, it also has the ability to play other instruments, including drums, saxophone, trumpet, and basic beats. So, this has similar considerations as new ways of using old tools, the amount of information, and how students learn, and how they also show their thinking. So, this is directly connected to how humans can passively absorb information from multiple sources at one time, and how it has influenced cultures and cultural activities, for example, music festivals and music and protests as well. Jenkins refers to cultural convergence as stories flowing across several kinds of media platforms, which allows the user to annotate, comment on, remix, and otherwise influence culture. The most obvious examples are blogs, vlogs, TikToks, Instagrams, things that people are able to comment directly on without requiring any prior knowledge or expertise. Other places we see this includes the news and new unique sources of the news, including Twitter in recent years, as well as the spread of traditional forms of media through the digitization of books and other forms of information. We've experienced both an increase in access due to proximity and things like language and cost as well. This is once again connected to all the major factors of the web. Cultural and global convergence have gone hand in hand as social media and news outlets are cross border and information also spreads rapidly. There are considerations of who can access what information, and there should always be critical reflection in the source of publication. But media convergence has changed the way we use tech to connect with each other on a wider global basis. I can be in my classroom with my students, and we could take a field trip to the Arctic. What has become clear is that the influence of media and technology on a user is incredibly complex. How that affects education, the way students learn, and how they express their learning is still continuing to unfold, and this is even more complex. What I do know is that students should be provided intentional learning activities and materials, and if the technology, like any other learning activity, is purposeful, intentional, and meaningful, students should be given the opportunity to engage with digital components to both consume and produce knowledge.